Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. We're recording this in the aftermath of the first Labour Party conference as a party of government since 2009. Keir Starmer and his team were elected on the winds of change, a new era for a new Britain. And yet, the mood in Liverpool this weekend has been uncertain. The party has got off to a rocky start in government. And there are already people who are beginning to suggest that it is suffering from a kind of midterm blues merely weeks into its life as a new administration. So, Bernard, when we chew over the party conference, what do you think are the top lines emanating from it? What is it that Labour have sought to do in Liverpool, and have they come close to achieving that?
Well, I think they had to do two things at the party conference. First of all was to lift the mood, because since they won the general election, and you can say quite properly, both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been pointing out the difficult decisions which are coming down the line, the difficult decisions which they're going to take on the 30th of October when we get the details of the budget. So in a sense, what they had to do was to try and lift the mood, to make it upbeat. After all, they just won a landslide victory just a matter of weeks ago. But the second thing that they had to do was to give some sort of idea about the kind of change they will deliver, given that they fought a general election campaign on the issue of change. Now, probably on the first objective, they had some limited success in Liverpool, but on the second objective, they manifestly failed. Jim Callaghan, when he came back from, Guadeloupe all those years ago, during the winter of discontent, said, "Crisis? What crisis?" And of course, at that particular time, he was in the teeth of industrial action from the trade unions. I suspect that the headline that I would put on this conference is change. What change? Because there is very little that I could see that he narrated in an upbeat, positive way. Everything is about buzzwords that we will forge a new Britain, and we'll forge a new way of doing things, and we'll take the people with us. But this, of course, is very, very long term. And insofar as there were any specific policy debates, the issue of the axing of the winter fuel allowance is still problematic, given that the conference effectively said you should be thinking again on this, although the vote is non-binding. So they didn't really do what I think they had to do. And in that sense, the question marks which were hanging over the Prime Minister going into the conference, those question marks remain, Alex.
Yes, what is Keir Starmer for? That is the question I think that a lot of people still want answered. You know, it is not enough to be an upgrade on his immediate predecessors in Downing Street. It is not enough just simply to be changed by being a different party, putting a different coloured rosette on change. You know, people need to see where the beef is. And I think that Starmer's speech, while elegantly crafted, didn't really manage to address that. You know, he said, if this path were popular or easy, we would have walked it already. Well, okay, yes, people can understand that. But it doesn't tell you exactly, what the end destination is and how you're going to get there. It's still very, very general. And you can get away with that in opposition to a degree, but it becomes much, much harder to do that in government. And, if you were putting a positive gloss on this, I suppose you would say that, look, Starmer and Reeves have a long-term vision, but they are finding it difficult to get their message across, partly because the media takes a very, very short-term view on things. And while there's a grain of truth in that, at the end of the day, it is your task to create the message, to sell the message to the people. And if you can't do that, then you can't really be blaming the media too much for that. And I think that there is this, you're right, we're still waiting for the detail. The budget is going to be extremely important. It's going to be a defining moment, actually, not just in year one of this government, but throughout its 4 or 5 years in office, because it will set the tone and the framework for everything else that it wishes to do. And so I think one of the interesting things that we see from Rachel Reeves is a hint that the fiscal rules the Labour Party has inherited from the Conservatives and has signed up to can be changed. And this seems to be quite sensible. I mean, the fiscal rules are, on one level, sensible in terms of not allowing debt to run out of control and so on, but they are also arbitrary in as much as the precise definitions of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable are calculated. And there are things that you can do to free up what they call fiscal headroom, which is essentially a fancy term for more money. And there are signs that is going to be happening when it comes to, say, the Bank of England's quantitative tightening. There are going to be fewer sales of UK gilts next year than had been foreseen. So that is actually going to free up 10, 15 billion pounds. The potential for tax increases in the budget is also going to give Reeves a bit more room for manoeuvre. But, is this enough? Has Reeves done enough to really sell this new direction?
No, because as you made the point yourself, we don't have the details. I mean, to be fair to the government, to be absolutely fair to the government, one of the reasons why there's not a great deal of change is that there is at the moment no fiscal headroom. If a new government comes in and it wants to enact a whole series of policies which have a price tag attached to a menu of choices, you have to have fiscal headroom to deliver that. And in a sense, the fact that they were not seeing a lot on the change agenda simply reflects that reality. Frankly, it was always going to be like this after Labour got in. What I did expect is that the midterm blues, which affect all governments, would come early in the life of this government because they couldn't change a lot very early. Labour's ability, I think, to win the next election really rests on what happens in the second half of the Parliament, not in the first half of the Parliament. But what both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor made clear is that tax cuts are coming. But given that they were perfectly clear, no increase in national insurance, no increase to income tax, no increase to value-added tax, if they're having to raise money in October, it is now abundantly clear where they're going, because there are only so many taxes that they can actually visit. It is perfectly clear that inheritance tax rules are going to be changed. Only about 1 in 10 estates in the United Kingdom are actually the subject of inheritance tax, so the rules are going to change there. The rules on capital gains tax are going to change as well to bring more money into the Treasury. And the third one, and this is politically the most sensitive and the most explosive, is the relates to pension contributions and the relief that the government give to taxpayers. Now, at the moment on that, those who pay basic rate tax get relief at 20%, and higher rate taxpayers get relief at 40%. If they move to a universal relief of 30%, it will mean in terms of pension pots longer term for the population that basic rate taxpayers will be a little bit better off in terms of what goes into their pot. But higher rate taxpayers are going to have a really, really big hit. And given that pension pots only work in the longer term over 20, 25 years, that kind of issue will have a profound effect for the future pension provision of the middle classes. One last thing that she may well have to do. The policy that was introduced by Rishi Sunak as Chancellor and was extended by Jeremy Hunt, the freezing of tax allowances, which means that it ensnares more people as their wages go up and the allowances remain the same, the phenomenon known as fiscal drag. It may well be that she will extend it to the lifetime of this Parliament, which will mean extending it to 2029 beyond the current position of it being due to be revisited in 2028. So I think we could almost write the budget at the moment in terms of where the tax increases are going to come.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Once you've ruled out national insurance, income tax and VAT, there is, only so many other places that you can go searching for money. And I think you're absolutely right, particularly on capital gains. One would see that as an easy win because, fundamentally, capital gains is a tax on on unearned income, in as much as it's a tax on an increase in wealth that the individual concerned themselves hasn't really contributed to very much themselves. So that's quite an easy one. Starmer, again, he talks a lot about how we must understand there are trade-offs. That every advance comes with a setback that some people will find difficult or unpopular. So, for instance, we need more houses, and there's widespread agreement on that. Well, that means building those houses where it might not be popular to build them. In a UK context, the shortage is particularly acute in London and the southeast of England. There is not very much point building lots of houses around Darlington if people don't actually want to live and work in Darlington. And there are aspects of that those problems apply in Scotland too, albeit on a less dramatic scale. But he's talking about you can't have low taxes and high quality public services. Well, yeah, fair enough. I think a lot of people, however, would quite reasonably observe that at present in the United Kingdom, we don't have either of those things. That is to say, we do not have low taxes because the overall tax take is actually at a 50 or 60-year high, as measured as a percentage of national income. And public services are clearly not of the quality people would like them to be. So, that is, when Starmer talks about, we must be wary of false choices, he is sort of actually making a false choice there himself, because nobody is actually really proposing drastic tax cuts at present. There is an acceptance that in the longer term, a lot of things are going to be more difficult and more expensive and need to be paid for. The ever-growing share of national wealth spent on the National Health Service is an obvious example of that. And if you're to increase productivity in the NHS, which in the longer term is the only way that you can fix some of the issues that are afflicting it at present, then that is, by definition, as I say, a longer term target and project. And this is where Starmer, again, is sort of out of step with the general national mood in some ways, because I think there is a clear and palpable yearning for quick and immediate change. But all the things he's talking about are long-term challenges. And so there is a mismatch between what people thought they were voting for in certain respects and what the government is now saying it's going to deliver. And I thought it was also, there are other things that were interesting in his speech. There was a reminder that actually, it's reasonable for people to be concerned about immigration. It's reasonable for people to want the rules to apply to all. There were hints there of Blair's tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. There were and an olive branch, if you like, to reform voters. And here in Scotland, we may talk about this a bit later. The fact that Reform are now challenging the Conservatives in the opinion polls is a very interesting development. But overall, this was a conference speech, I thought, that pled for patience in an impatient age.
Oh, absolutely. And because there's been no rush of good news stories from the government, and as I said, there was never going to be. One of the reasons why they didn't, they pledged change, but what they actually pledged was a slogan. They didn't define that change, and the reason they didn't define that change is that there's no fiscal headroom in order to deliver anything. And that's why we have, if you like, the midterm blues, which have kicked in a matter of months, which actually raises a very, very interesting question. When we get to something approaching midpoint in 2026, what will the midterm blues look like then for Labour? And particularly, could the work that Scottish Labour have been doing, and we have to remember that in terms of putting on share of the vote and going forward, Scottish Labour's result at the general election was much more impressive than the party's performance south of the border, and therefore there is an obvious question as to the extent to which, if Starmer's government becomes deeply unpopular, whether or not that will act as a brake to Anas Sarwar's ambitions to be First Minister. Now, at the moment, I simply don't know the answer to that. I think there are a number of observations that I would make. The SNP, of course, if the Labour government in London happens to be unpopular and is not delivering change, and if there are cuts in public expenditure, If there is austerity, although Rachel Reeves says that there won't be austerity, the SNP are simply going to say the difficulties that we have in Scotland are as a result of the Barnett consequentials that flow because of decisions which are taken by the Treasury in London. Now, I think that's an obvious line for them to take, but I think we've both agreed before, that is not going to fly this time for the simple reason that the SNP will have been in power 19 years and their poor record in areas of public policy is cutting through with voters in Scotland. That in part explains the rout that they had to endure at the general election just a matter of weeks ago. But Labour simply cannot rest on having a good general election result and automatically assuming that it is a springboard to being the largest party in 2026. And if things are going badly for Labour in London, and I don't know if they will, let's just wait and see what happens. But if things go badly, the cross-border contamination issue in terms of how it affects the domestic political agenda will be a worry for Scottish Labour, which is why I do believe at the end of the day that the result after 2026 is going to be very, very messy indeed.
Absolutely. And, that is certainly concentrating minds within Scottish Labour right now. I think it was quite noticeable that Anna Sarwar, on the whole, has been taking a more optimistic, upbeat tone in recent weeks that contrasts a little bit with the sort of gloomier mood music coming out of Whitehall. Because Sarwar understands that, we need to be able to show that a Labour government actually delivers the change it promises. And at present, with regard to, Scotland, it's not quite clear exactly how that is going to be done. You have the announcement that GB Energy is going to be headquartered in Aberdeen with subsidiary offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow, because everybody must have a prize, however small, which is sort of symptomatic of the way this government will want to approach things, I think. But it's not yet clear exactly what GB Energy is going to do. At the moment, it is not much more than a brass plaque on an office building. It isn't going to be, I think, the kind of transformational vehicle that a lot of people think or assume it will be. It's going to be a facilitator of other things, in some ways working a bit more like a national investment bank, but with energy as its only area of expertise or interest. And that is fine, and it might well have desirable policy outcomes in the longer term. But I'm not sure it's the sort of thing that is actually going to capture the public's imagination. And therein, I think, lies a problem for the Labour Party, because if you take away GB Energy in terms of what it's delivering for Scotland at the moment, what else is there? And even when you control for the fact that obviously a lot of the things that the Labour government will be wanting to do in England, it cannot do in Scotland, because those are devolved responsibilities and therefore stewarded by the SNP at present. You still are left with the thing that the election in 2026, is going to be status quo with the SNP or change with Labour. But if Labour haven't demonstrated change in London, then is the risk of the status quo really all that bad?
Yeah, there is another big issue, and that is to what extent the issue of austerity, and let's just tease this out for a second or two, there is the issue to which austerity will play at the election in 2026. Now, if we remember during the general election campaign in Scotland, during the BBC leaders debate, Anas Sarwar turned to John Swinney and said, "Read my lips, no austerity." Now, the Chancellor in her speech said no austerity. I suppose it depends how you're defining austerity. My definition of austerity would be real terms cuts to public expenditure year on year, where public expenditure is not keeping up with pace in the rate of inflation. Now, I suspect that for political reasons, that Rachel Reeves on the 30th of October will make sure that the health budget is not only protected, but will increase. And I suspect that in politically sensitive public services, the imperative will be on Labour to protect these. Now, the consequentials for the Scottish bloc are important because if in the next couple of years, the amount of money that comes to Scotland by way of consequentials topping up the bloc grant is higher in real terms, then there is no austerity. The austerity charge that the SNP will want to make against the Labour government will not stick if the consequentials are at least in line with the rate of inflation. The flip side of that coin is that if there are real terms cuts to the Scottish bloc, then they will be able to make an argument about austerity, and that could be a more difficult terrain for Anas Sarwar to navigate. I think there is still all to play for. I think the immediate aftermath of the election, I detected within Scottish Labour the kind of feel-good factor that we got after the 2010 election, where, if you remember, Labour lost power in the UK, but still had a very strong performance in Scotland, and people thought it was just a question of Ian Gray marking time to the election in 2011, take what had happened in 2010, and they would get over the line. And it didn't happen. Not only did it not happen, but of course the SNP went on to bust the system at the Scottish Parliament election in 2011. I suspect that the big issues which are facing Labour in London give the SNP a measure of hope in the election, because the Nationalists will have been very, very down after the general election. I still think that it's all to play for, but Labour have to ensure that there ain't no austerity. That's number one. And number two, on the domestic political agenda, they have to hang the SNP's record around the SNP's neck.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right that the SNP argument in 2026, in fact, we already hear this, is that, look, it turns out that swapping a blue rosette for a red rosette in London, in Westminster, in the House of Commons, in Whitehall, and so on, doesn't actually deliver any kind of change whatsoever. It is just more of the same, and the same has failed Scotland, and so more of the same is going to fail Scotland. And that is a very straightforward argument. I'm not sure it's one that people bought at the general election. In fact, I know it's one that people did not buy at the general election. But as you correctly observed, so by 2026 and so on, we'll be approaching the sort of midterm era of the Starmer government. And so it is more credible, perhaps, if things don't improve or are felt to be improving, for the SNP to make that accusation in 2026. As we've talked about before, John, I mean, I'm not persuaded that a shortage of money is the Scottish government's actual main problem when it comes to the delivery of public services. I think the way in which that money is spent is much more problematic. For instance, an ever-increasing amount of public spending is spent on public sector salaries. Now, obviously, some of that needs to happen and so on. But if you're putting more money into the NHS, for example, what is a better use of that money? Is it higher pay for doctors and nurses, or is it more MRI and CT scanners? There are trade-offs to be made there. And I think that one of the things that the Scottish government has not done well is that kind of long-term investment in the NHS. And here the Scottish government is a microcosm of a wider UK failing, which is a lack of long-term investment in infrastructure, in the building blocks that public services actually require. So there are a lot of challenges there. But, 2026, I completely agree with you, Bernard, that the notion that it is certain that the SNP will be out of power is not, that's not certain. It is not obvious that there will be a kind of formal or tacit rainbow unionist coalition to shut the SNP out of office. It is quite possible that the election result will be one which prompts that old saying, isn't it? The people have spoken. Now, can somebody please explain what it is they've said? because the opinion polling at present, we're a long way away from the election, obviously, is extremely messy. You see the potential for big gains for reform. You see Alex Salmond's Alba party with the possibility of picking up 1 or 2 seats on the regional list. The Greens are in a very happy place politically at the moment, out of office, and so therefore not to be blamed for the government's woes, but in a good position to pick up disgruntled left-wing votes at the expense of the SNP. The Nationalists, it's difficult to see them falling below 33% of the vote. You're going to have a very different parliament, quite possibly, and one in which the various parliamentary arithmetic will work in a very different way from what we've been accustomed to over this long period of SNP dominance. I suppose we should also, when we note the Reformer are now doing almost as well as the Conservatives in certain opinion polls. Sir John Curtis was suggesting that a recent opinion poll that had Reform on 12%, that could lead to a situation where there were 16 Reform MSPs and 16 Conservative MSPs in Scotland. And I suppose that sort of doomsday scenario for the Conservative Party leads us into an event that ought to be a bigger event than it actually feels like, which is the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party's leadership contest, which is finally coming to a close, even though most people haven't noticed that it was ever open.
Indeed, and the one television debate, the Scotland Tonight debate on STV that I saw, defamed the idea of a damp squib. It was a debate which was just completely and utterly lacking in any substance. They were trading cliches, but I suppose that the one thing that was bubbling away in the background, and Colin Mackay, who was presenting the programme, did his level best to try and tease out whether or not there were a whole lot of dirty tricks that were going on behind the scenes in this election. But of course, we've got Megan Gallagher, we've got Murdo Fraser, and we've got Russell Finlay. One of the issues here, of course, is that the membership of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is not all that large. In fact, none of these three candidates would say on that leaders' debate how many members they have. Now, it is widely accepted that it is around the 7,000 mark, so a lot will depend on the turnout. But my sense of it is that, if they were going for experience, if they were going for someone who was around the block, if they were going for someone who has some ideological anchors, then they should go for Murdo Fraser, because I think that there'll be more of a cutting political edge to his leadership. But the problem is that Murdo's anchors in the Conservative Party go right the way back to the time when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and the membership of the party has greatly changed in that time. And therefore, the kind of people that perhaps would have gravitated towards him are either no longer members or who have passed on to the great politics in the sky, which leads us really with Russell Finlay. And I think that behind the scenes, there is certainly, if you talk to people in the Conservative Party, they will say it's an establishment stitch-up for Russell. Although the problem with this line, establishment stitch-up, and of course we put these points to both Brian Whittle and Megan Gallagher in previous podcasts, who exactly are the establishment? I think certainly Russell Finlay would be the candidate that Conservative MPs would prefer. I think probably a majority of the group would prefer Russell Finlay, and I expect on Friday that he will emerge victorious. But, it has been a contest which is a total ideas-free zone. It's been an articulation of all actually that's wrong with modern politics, where you have people who trade cliches for the prize of being leader without actually really knowing or understanding what you do with political power and what the end games are. And to have an end game, you first of all have to have a philosophical base. And I can't see that two of the three candidates in this contest have any philosophical base at all.
No, I mean, say what you will about Murdo Fraser, but nobody is in any doubt that he's a Conservative, and they understand why he's a Conservative. Many of Russell Friendly's friends and former colleagues are astonished to discover that in middle age he has outed himself as a true blue Tory. And you're right that it's been a complete non-event in pursuit of a prize of dubious worth in the first place, but one where, what the Tories should have been having, it seems to me, is a discussion about, well, how do we actually revive and create space for right-of-centre thinking in Scottish politics? Because everybody understands, and this does include the candidates themselves, to be fair to them, that there are more people who are at least sympathetic to right-of-centre ideas in Scottish politics than there are people who are prepared to vote for the Conservative Party. Now, it's true that some of those people can cheerfully vote for the SNP too, because it's a catch-all national party. But, nevertheless, the Tory failure over the last 25 years, really, has been the failure to articulate an alternative to a very comfortable, sometimes cosy, often extremely smug Scottish left-of-centre political consensus. And so the big question for the Conservative Party isn't so much, is our target to have 20 or 24 or 28 or whatever it is, members of the Scottish Parliament? Is our target actually to start influencing the battle for ideas, political argument in Scotland, and trust that by moving that argument onto terrain that is more favourable to us, then in the long term, people will see us as an appropriate and responsible and attractive vehicle for those ideas. But I think it's the ideas that start first, and then the political payoff comes afterwards. But I see no sign in this leadership contest that the Conservative Party is ready to understand that, let alone to really articulate anything. It's not enough just to say cut income tax, or cut spending. There needs to be a real discussion about what is the alternative to the left of centre consensus that in certain respects, is not serving Scotland very well at present. If people are unhappy about the size of government, the amount of tax they're paying, the state of public services in health and education, social care, transport and other issues, then perhaps there are other ways of organising some of these things that might be better, that might be worth trying. But the Conservative Party has been an ideas-free zone for more than a political generation. It is moribund. Even if you ask Tory MSPs, what's your education policy? And they'll say, what, we have one? And so that has been the real failure of this so-called leadership, so-called contest.
Although 2026, I do believe, will be very, very messy, we will both agree that there is no chance, absolutely no chance, that the Conservatives will come second in the election in 2026. They might not come third. And just as there is the possibility of cross-border contamination of politics, which will lead to a break on the electoral prospects for parties in Scotland, just as there is the prospect of cross-border contamination for Labour, where Labour's performance in Scotland is affected by how people perceive the government in London, there is also the same possibility that this will happen to the Scottish Conservatives. They are the most unionist of the parties after all, and if the national Conservative leadership contest, what emerges from it is a lurch to the right in order to try and head off to reform, that will simply scare a lot of middle-of-the-road Conservatives in Scotland. But if reform in 2026 still have the Conservatives in a UK sense on the run, if they still have them on the run, then a number of people who are robustly right-wing in Scotland will say, well, why should I bother voting Conservative? Why should I not just vote for reform? And of course, the argument, which is more attractive in the context of the Scottish elections, is that in England you can pile up all of these votes for reform, but because of the electoral system, you can get a relatively high percentage share of the vote, but a very low percentage share of the seats. That ain't the dynamic in Scotland. And so the Scottish Conservatives could be hit by a double whammy, where people who are on the right are going to peel off to Reform because they know that the vote actually counts in a proportional electoral system, and middle-of-the-road Conservatives, who by and large stick with the Tories at election time, will be put off by the rightward drift. And I mean, a party which is only polling around 13% of the vote in a national election, the lowest ever for the Scottish Tories, it is not an exaggeration to say that the challenge for the new leader on Friday is to keep them in the game at all, because we could be looking at potential electoral Armageddon in 2026.
Yeah, all over again, because the Tories have been through this. They've been around this course before. You're right. I mean, I think it's also important to note that Reform is the ideal vehicle for people who are just fed up with politics and politicians of all parties. I think we have to appreciate that there is a difference between Reform and the Brexit Party, even though Reform is built on the Brexit Party, and there is a difference between Reform and UKIP, even though Reform can obviously trace its ancestry back to UKIP. Because, if you have a party that is getting 10% of the voting share, albeit only in opinion polls at present in Scotland, I think it is quite difficult to make the case that this is a purely English nationalist party. Other things are going on. That there is a component of that, perhaps, but it is far more, I think, a plague on all your houses party. And there is a significant percentage of the Scottish electorate that often doesn't vote in Holyrood elections, but that would like to see devolution end it, would like to abolish the Scottish Parliament. And Reform, I think, is picking up quite a bit of support from those voters. So, there is a constituency for that. It's one that would be fatal for the Scottish Conservatives to embrace, I think. But it is difficult for the Scottish Tories to head off that challenge in some ways, because plenty of the people who are not sold on devolution, who think it's a failed experiment, will nevertheless at present grudgingly vote for Conservative candidates. But this is a question of sensibility more than it is of actual policy. And that's where Reform are tapping into the sort of scunnered vote. And they see great opportunities there, because you've had an SNP government that will have been in power for almost 2 decades, a Labour government that is currently struggling to make much progress, a Conservative Party that is out of ideas and lacks the courage of any convictions at all in Scotland. That is fertile ground for an insurrectionist party such as Reform that doesn't have to have policies, doesn't have to have a coherent manifesto or agenda or anything like that, just has to have an attitude. And that attitude is to hell with all of you. And that is very, very dangerous for the Conservatives, but it's also probably dangerous for Scottish politics more generally.
Yeah, we should probably do a podcast on Reform and analyse the scope that it has for making gains in Scotland, and to tease out some of these issues. I actually agree very substantially with that analysis, Alec. I think it's beyond just being an English nationalist party. I think it speaks to a whole series of attitudes that you can find within the electorate. And it will be interesting to see what they do in 2026. And the Scottish Conservatives, I think, are potentially very panicked over all of this. But that's all for another day. Do remember to get in touch with us. It's ponsonbymassie@gmail.com. If you want to get in touch via X, it's at Ponsonby Massie. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, do get in touch with us. And do remember to like the podcast if you're watching on YouTube as well. But for the moment, from this edition, it's a goodbye from me in a not-so-sunny Vermont today. In fact, it's Gaidrich in Vermont today. I will be heading to Boston for some clam chowder later on today. But from this edition, for me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me as well.